Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of That 60s Recording Podcast. My name is Joe Montague, and today I am honoured to be joined by the legendary Ken Scott. This man needs no introduction, even though I give him a fairly lengthy introduction when I speak to him. Please forgive the sound quality. This was recorded in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I had to speak to him via Skype. But it's all should be audible. It's absolutely fine. So please enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Mr. Ken Scott. Really privileged today to be joined by recording royalty, if I may, Mr. Ken Scott. I would imagine if you're listening to this podcast, you will absolutely know who this man is. But just for the sake of clarity, I'm going to list some of the people that you've worked with. And it's a pretty astounding list. Obviously, the Beatles, Jeff Beck Group, Pink Floyd, Elton John, David Bowie. I mean, that's the sort of the creme de la creme of British pop as it, that exists. Level 42, Duran Duran, Billy Cobham, Mahavishnu Orchestra, Supertramp, Stanley Clarke, and I'm sure there's lots more that are not out there listed. That is a pretty ridiculous list.
yeah, absolutely ridiculous. It's stupid.
It's amazing. I mean, is there anybody you wish that you had recorded with that you didn't work with?
Well, if we're talking drums, then there are two. I would love to have recorded Bonham, see what his kit was really like, and Gene Krupa.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yeah, that's about it.
What is it about Gene Krupa that piques your interest?
I don't know. I loved what he did from way back when. There was an old movie on TV one Saturday afternoon, I think it was, a musical of some kind. And he was in it. And I just have this memory of his doing a complete drum solo in the engine room of a boat.
Wow.
And it just blew me away. And just since then, boy, I would love to have worked with him.
There's definitely a musical drummer. Is that something, I mean, I guess like as a producer and as an engineer, the nature of the artists you've worked with have tended to be quite artistic artists, if you know what I mean. And
I've covered the gamut. You've got the very straightforward English rock drummer Woody Woodmansey. Slightly further than that, you've got Ringo, who was an incredible English drummer, but he threw some things in that most English drummers wouldn't. And then I go to the extreme of the most musical drummer I've ever worked with, Terry Bozzio. I've done everything in between, Steve Gadd. Just a whole bunch of them.
I mean, obviously, as a drummer, this is something I'm really interested in. I mean, who do you have a favourite drummer that you've worked with?
No.
For
different types of music, it depends what you're talking about. As I say, the most musical drummer was Bozzio, but there is no other drummer like him. So on one level, he is my favourite. But then Cobham, he was amazing. Ringo, Woody, Bob Siedenberg. It just so many incredible drummers I've worked with.
Yeah, that's a special list as well. I wonder if we could talk right back at the beginning. When you first sent out applications to start to work in studios, did you have any idea what working at somewhere like Abbey Road might look like?
First and foremost, let me go back. What I wanted to do was work with tape, not so much. I loved music, so obviously if I could put the two together, it would be great. But I got a Grundig TK25 tape machine when I was 12 and a half, and I fell in love with tape. That was it for me. And it was looking towards getting a job working with tape. A couple of years after that, I guess maybe when I was 14, something like that, there was a TV series on called Here Come the Girls, which was based around each week they'd have a different top English female singer. And there happened to be one week, one with a singer called Carol Dean that had a couple of hits over here that I was totally in lust with. And I had to watch that. And at one point it panned from her singing into a mic, and it panned up to this window looking down on her. Now, I didn't know it, so I got an idea of what a studio could be like just from that. What I didn't know at the time was that that particular studio would become a home away from home for me, because it happened to be number 2 studio. What at the time was EMI Recording Studios, and it now is Abbey Road. So, yeah, I had a vague idea, but it was very vague.
In your mind's eye, when you were applying for places at studios, was Abbey Road where you wanted to end up, or was that just what came along at the right time?
It was the only one that came along.
Was serendipity.
Yeah. Being at the right place at the right time, that whole thing.
So you started at Abbey Road. Would you say it was at the height of Beatlemania? So you must have been aware of everything that was happening when you got the job there.
Of course, with them, they were my favourite band. It was about two or 3 weeks before their first trip to the States. So at that point, yeah, they were big. They hadn't broken the American market at that point, so they hadn't reached the pinnacle of the biggest band in the world. But they were certainly still huge when I started there.
Did you envisage working with them at some stage? That must have been an aim at that point.
No way on earth.
No.
No, of course not. In fact, it was the interview that I had. One of the questions was, who is your favorite band? And I always go on about that voice that's deep within you that you have to listen to. And that voice deep within me told me that don't say the Beatles. They were my favorite band, but it said don't say that. So I didn't. I said the Dave Clark Five. And the two guys that were interviewing me looked at each other and then said, why? And once again, listening to that inner voice, it was, well, I think the difference is between Dave Clark Five and everyone else is the addition of the saxophone and the keyboards. It makes them sound different to everyone else. And they just looked at each other and grinned. And that was it. And it was because I didn't say the Beatles that I got the job.
So you were already developing an ear for distinctive sounds.
My inner voice was, I was.
Subconsciously. Yeah. I don't know why, but I'm always fascinated by the fact that Abbey Road particularly, I don't know necessarily if other studios work this way, but I like you got the job in the tape library and then you work your way up through the motions. To me, that takes away some of the mysticism of how does this person become a producer, because it makes the process a bit more stepwise, and that humanizes it for me a little bit. Do you feel that was a good way of learning, to go through those steps?
At the time, probably not quite so much, because it's, well, when am I going to move up to become a recording engineer? Yeah. At the time, it seemed as if everything was dragging. I would like things to have gone on faster. But thinking back on it, no, I had the most amazing training in the world. No one will ever have the kind of training that I had, because, yeah, that whole thing of starting at the bottom and working up, that is the best way to learn. Now, for me, it was that much better because of that band again, the Beatles. The first time I ever sat behind a mixing console on a session, I had no idea what any of it did. And it happened to be for the Beatles. And so the first session was a write-off, but it was a write-off both from me and from the band. So it wasn't quite that bad. And because I'd worked with them as an assistant engineer for, I think it was 4 albums, we'd built enough of a relationship, I think, that they trusted me that I would actually get something together, which I did, and we continued working together. But within working with that particular band, I got to experiment more than anyone will ever get to experiment. Here's the band that they have no time limit, they have no monetary problems, budgets or anything, and they wanted things to sound different every single time they were recorded. So that gave me carte blanche to experiment with mics in different positions, different pieces of equipment, and I learned what I like to work with, the mics I like to work with, and EQ and all of that kind of thing, through them, just being able to experiment with them. It was amazing. And most engineers get thrown in they're doing like or it used to be, they were doing 3 songs in a 3-hour session. You have to be on the ball then. I didn't. I could do whatever I wanted, and it was amazing.
I'd never really thought about it like that. That sounds quite liberating.
Look, I was working on the premise that I could screw everything up, use completely the wrong mics in completely the wrong place, overcompressed, wrong EQ, all of that. And there was as much chance of the members of the band coming up and saying, oh, that sounds like shit, as there was them coming up and saying, oh, that sounds like shit, but I like it, we'll use it. And that's amazingly freeing.
I can imagine. And how did that go down with the brass at EMI? Did you feel like you were able to experiment because of you were working with the Beatles? Kind of gave you a freedom pass?
I was hauled over the coals so often with the top brass because the Beatles would always want to do things in the evening. Now, we didn't have cell phones or anything like that. No one had the home phone numbers for any of the management or anything like that. So when the Beatles wanted to do something, I'm not going to be the one to turn around and say, no, you can't do it. The management maybe could do that, but I had to go along with it. And so then the next day, when the management found out, they would haul you over the coals, tell you off, and then you'd be put back, and the same thing would happen in a couple of days' time.
In terms of specifics, I don't know how much specific gear we are going to talk about, or how much is necessary to get into, because the information is out there. But I'm obviously interested in drums, and that's in some ways the most complex of the mic setups. Did you have a recognized way of recording drums that you were taught that you used? Well,
always at the start, I was following on an engineer called Jeff Emmerich.
Yes.
And I, of course, set up exactly the same way as he did to start with, because I had no idea what I was doing. So, of course, I'm going to follow what he had done. And then slowly but surely, things would get changed. How things changed, I have no idea. I honestly can't remember. But they did change. Like, as I said, the Beatles wanted things to sound different every time. And it reached the point, I remember one time going into the room where all of the mics were kept. Paul wanted to record, he wanted to use a different mic on something, and I can't remember what it was. But he and I went into the mic room. We're looking around. I'm looking at the mics that I think might sound good on it. He's completely different way of looking at things. He said, oh, I like that mic up there. It looks cool. We'll use it. He was more interested in the way it looked than how it sounded.
I love that.
It's that kind of thing. So there was a lot of experimentation, yeah. Well, they pulled you to come up with things. You've had to all the time.
To me, that's ringing forward the fact that you obviously went on to be a successful producer. Is this the beginnings of your education in production? To me is among other things, coming up with unique sounds that work for the song, and especially in pop music, help songs stand out on their own 2 feet. This feels like a good training for you moving forward to what you were later going to start doing.
My training towards what I eventually did started the first day I started at Abbey Road. It's, to me, 75% of the gig is personality driven. It's how you get on with people. If they don't trust you, if they don't like you, they're going to be looking over your shoulder the entire time. And that's the worst way to try and work. You've got to get on well with people. And being an assistant engineer at Abbey Road, they were always 3-hour sessions, except for the Beatles. They were generally 3-hour sessions. It would be 10 to 1 in the morning, 2:30 to 5:30 in the afternoon, 7 to 10 in the evening. And you'd be working on totally different things. In the morning, you could be doing a big classical session and seeing how the classical engineer worked and how the classical producer worked. And got on with the artist and all of that. Then the afternoon, you could be working on a dance band recording, see how they work. And then the evening, you could be working with Pink Floyd and seeing how they all work. It was the perfect place, a training, to see how people work together, what you have to do as a producer to draw the best out of people and all of that. Now, as far as I'm concerned, with regard to production, I figure my gig is to get the recording the best way possible in the way that the act wants it to be, just to show them off at the best way possible. I'm not there to help sell records. I'm there just to make a great recording that they'll be proud of and that I'll be proud of. To me, a great record starts off, it's the song and the performance. They're the two things that are the most important thing on a record. Everything else is just icing on the cake. Everything else is just there. If the performance isn't there, if the song isn't there, it means shit. It won't be. It could be a hit, but it won't be remembered in 5 years, 10 years time.
I think it's quite interesting. Something that it was done. I mean, in the 60s, 70s, and is still done now sometimes, is the getting the basic track together. And that's perhaps what you're talking about as the song being the song, and the bells and whistles are the overdubs and the other bits and pieces. Do you think that there's something to be taken from doing a basic track that perhaps isn't there now with, you might start with an acoustic guitar and just run it over and over again until it's right, and chopping parts, and that just didn't exist.
That's where I draw the line.
Yeah,
the chopping the parts. It's no, you should get a good performance. When I do vocals, I will once again the luck, the blessings that I've had. I've worked with the most amazing studio performer ever, as far as I'm concerned, and that was Bowie. I co-produced 4 albums with him, and 95% of the vocals on those 4 albums were one take, beginning to end, first take.
Wow.
I would run the tape just to get him to sing along a bit so I could get the sound and the level. Then I'd take the tape back, hit record, and what he did that one time through is what we still hear today. That's what I mean by performance. It's not, I'm only going to sing the chorus once and then you copy and paste it every time, or you keep doing that. Now, because I've yet to find another Bowie, what I generally do for vocals is I'll do 7 takes from beginning to end, because I want a performance every time. And then I'll go away and on my own, I'll piece it together. But it has to be beginning to end. Otherwise, you don't get that performance.
That's incredible that so much of it is first take. And that's probably why so much of it sounds so special.
But it's down to good songs. Look, for me, a good song is one that you can sit down with an acoustic guitar and it sounds just as good with one acoustic guitar and a vocalist as it does with all the bells and whistles. That is a good song. Bowie wrote good songs and he certainly knew how to perform them. I
mean, that's something that you hear a lot about when you talk to people about the top performance, even in this modern performers. I'm trying to think of an example of somebody that might be this. I mean, Adele springs to mind. I'm sure I've heard similar stories of artists like that who are really worth the caliber, that they just have it and they are true performers in their own right, rather than the flash in the pans who have to be cobbled together, if you like.
Yeah, one thing that I've noticed, it's not just the artists that want things cobbled together, to use your word. It seems as if everyone that's the way records are supposed to be made now. Before moving back over to England, I lived 2 years in Nashville, which to me, Nashville is now the center of the music industry in the States. Everywhere else is dying, whereas Nashville is just building and building and building. And it's not just country music now. It's thanks to people like Jack White. There's a multitude of different types of music coming from there. But there are some amazing, amazing session musicians there. And they're not even giving their best these days, because they know that at the end of their take, someone's going to push the button and say, "Thanks, guys, we got enough. We can copy and paste it together." Why, if you're going to be told that at the end of a take, why do you even bother giving your best? Why struggle to up your performance because someone is going to say, "Oh, we can copy and paste it together"?
You're absolutely right. these are things that we should know, and they seem so obvious, but they're just not being listened to. I don't know how we've ended up at a point where well, a lot of records are made this way, and then records that aren't made this way are celebrated like they're something special, which they are, but this was being done 60 years ago.
Yeah. Well, that's why there's still interest in records from 60, 50, 40 years ago, because that's the way we used to do it. We used to have talent that performed and wrote good songs. We didn't need 30 people to write a damn song. We didn't need 9 producers on a track. It's absurd where we've reached now.
Yeah, and I completely concur. And then some of the tracks that have so many people on seem, well, I mean, lyrically they're not even anywhere. There's nothing happening.
Quite correct.
So I know that you do a lot of work at Beckett University now. Is this something that you're trying to instill in students that you work with, or I don't know if this is quite the right word, but the maybe the balance, or I was going to say juxtaposition of your experiences recording and then what you're seeing people recording now in young people who are moving into the industry?
Well, it's each to his own. There is no wrong in recording, as long as you are getting what you want out of the recording, then it's good. If you want it to sound lo-fi and you're making it sound lo-fi, that's great. Who am I to say it's bad? There are certain things for me that I find hard to deal with in students' recordings, and I will always pull them up on it. One of the things for me is the volume of the vocal. I can't mix in the box. I can only mix using a console. I like the tactile thing of pushing up and playing with faders. And one of the things that I do is I play with the vocal level all the way through a song. I will go through quite a few times, just learning the quiet words, the loud words, the quiet syllables and loud syllables, because I play the vocal all the way through to make sure that it's at the volume I want it every single moment of that recording. Whereas when you do it in the box, you can't do that. And so what happens is a lot of students they'll find the level for the vocal at some point during the song. Now, at the beginning, it might be a bit too loud because there's only acoustic guitar or piano going on at the beginning. So the vocal may be a bit too loud then. But then the drums and the bass come in and everything comes up a bit, and then the vocal's at the right level. But then all of the guitars come in and everything, and because the vocal's just left at one level, suddenly it's a bit too quiet. You can't always hear everything. Then those drop out and you go back to the drums and the bass and the acoustic guitar and piano, and it's at the right volume again. Then it gets quiet. It's that kind of thing where there are things you can't do in the box that you can do on a console, and that annoys me. The concentration should be on getting everything to come through at the right volume. Of course, the vocal is one of them.
I find it really interesting because what you're describing is mixing. You're just mixing, and that, especially with videos on YouTube that are trying to entice you to click on them, makes mixing for a lot of people look like it's a bit of an enigma. And obviously there's a huge amount of skill and art involved in mixing a record, but a lot of these sort of tips and tricks, so to speak, make you think that there's some real super mystery behind it. And I think a lot of what's missed is what you're describing, sitting with the vocal level and a fader and just riding the vocal through the song rather than trying to compress it and de-ess it to make it fit all one size. It can't be one size fits all.
Right, precisely. But if you use this particular piece of gear, your mixes will always be perfect. Yeah, like fuck.
It must be such a frustration for you, having gone through, I don't know what you'd call this, it's almost classical training for mixing now, that it's really, on the face of it, could be quite a simple task. And I think there's a lot of, I say could be, I'm really careful with the words that I'm trying to use here, because I don't want to, the skill involved is unreal, but it's on the face of it, the principles of it are fairly simple.
But one of the other things, though, that makes mixing that much simpler is that I make a lot of my calls on the recording. Number one, I will decide. I've heard of mixing engineers, they'll get Pro Tool set up, and there are like 12 different guitar solos, because no one would make the decision as to which is the guitar solo, so they have to go through and do it. I make decisions all the time. I EQ on the way in. I get the sound that I want on the way in, and it's there permanently. More often than not, when I come to mix, I don't have to EQ anything else.
It's really interesting. It's quite inspiring to hear that. And do you have any idea of why people are incapable of making decisions at the moment, it seems?
I come from a time when we had very few choices. Most of the stuff, because I started on 4-track. We'd be recording on one track. We'd be recording bass, drums, keyboards, and possibly guitars, all mixed together at the same time. So you had to make the decision of what all of these things sounded like for the final thing, then and there. I've continued that. Okay, I moved to 8-track, so I could separate it a bit, but it was still very much making decisions on what the sound was going to be like very early on. And that's just continued. And I just still do that. I'm a firm believer that trainee engineers should start off on 4-track. There should be one semester in universities where all they work on is 4-track.
I think you're probably absolutely right. That sounds like a brilliant idea.
Yeah, of course. No one wants to work that way, so it doesn't actually happen. One of the things that I find that I like to do at Leeds Beckett, and I push to do as much as possible, is actual sessions. I can talk till I'm blue in the face, and a certain amount of what I say goes in. But the best way to see what I do and how I work is to watch me actually working. Because there are a lot of things, I've been doing this for 50 years. There are a lot of things that I do without even thinking about it. So those things that I do without thinking about, I don't teach, because I don't realize what I'm doing. Whereas if I'm doing a session and there are people behind me watching, they'll see me reach out and change the EQ on something suddenly. Why did you do that? I have to think about it at that point, and, oh, well, I did it because. And to me, that's a much better learning experience. That's the way I learned. That and experimenting. And that's another thing with so many students. There are a lot of rooms at Leeds Beckett, and the number of times I walk down the corridor and most of those rooms are empty. They should be using those rooms to experiment, to find their own sound. If they can't find someone to come in and play for them, then at least sit in there and listen to stuff that they like through the speakers in there, so they get used to hearing, well, I like that record because the bass sounds like that, but I like that record because the drums sound like that. It should be an entirely a learning experience. It shouldn't be, oh, I'm going to take a couple of classes and I can go and produce and engineer U2 or Beyonce or whatever.
Yeah, it seems to be an expectation of, you watch a few YouTube videos and suddenly you can do it. And I think maybe a lot of the websites where you can employ things like, I don't know if you're aware of these, but like Fiverr, or there's a few other websites where you can book people to do things very cheaply and potentially not very well. And it might, presumably will be the people who we're discussing now. I mean, obviously there's nothing wrong with people learning, but at the same time, there's nobody showing the way like you're describing anymore.
Right, and that goes as far, for me, it goes as far as like mastering. Now, mastering is this super complex thing where you have to use all of this gear to make something sound good. I come from the day where a mastering engineer would do as little as they possibly could to what they get in, because it's the engineer and the producer have decided how they want something to sound. And so the mastering engineer gets it. They may add like 2 dB at 10K or something like that, just to give a little bit more up top, just minor changes like that. But nowadays, they go nuts. They'll do all of this kind of stuff to what they're given. And I've had this discussion with mastering engineers that I really like. And they say the problem is that most of what they get in these days is shit. So they have to try and make it sound good. My argument to that is, if you're making it sound good, the people that are giving it to you are never going to learn that what they're creating is shit. They think that what they hear on the radio or wherever is what they did, and it's not what you did. But they say, look, it's a business. This is how we have to get them to keep on coming back. If it means that we make them sound great all the time, that's the way it has to be.
That's a fascinating point. I mean, obviously, I'm fascinated by the fact that you spent 2 years mastering at Abbey Road, if I'm correct, before you'd even mixed a song.
Yes.
That feels, in the modern way, that's backwards.
No, it's not. Don't forget, we were talking about, we were working on vinyl back then. Now, there are limitations to what you can put on vinyl. You can't have too much low end. The record will jump. You have to be very careful of high end, and especially of sibilance, because it will make the cutting head distort. So the management at Abbey Road, they were clever enough that they realized it's best to learn the problems before you can work on something tape, which you have absolutely no problem putting anything on.
It seems so sensible. Again, you can't see, but I'm grinning away because I love. This is why I love this style of recording so much. Is it's just feels like a something that's not there nowadays. It's really. Really been lost, and I find it really, really interesting. And I think I hope I remember this correctly. I think I mentioned when I first got in contact with you, I read your book about a year ago, and blitzed my way through it because it just ate all of the information up. And I think there's a part of it you talk about drum miking, and you're talking about phase, and you said, again, I hope I remember this correctly. You said phase. What's phase? We just knew that it sounded good, and that was it. And when I read that's amazing. I love that attitude.
Yeah, we have become so infatuated with minutia. It's ridiculous. All of the different things, everything from, well, you have to have a DI box that costs £1,000 because this is gold plated, that's platinum plated, and all that. You'll never get a good bass sound without this very expensive DI box. That's bullshit. The ones that we used to use were put together by the guy upstairs for like £5. And you need a good bass, you need a good bass player, then you'll get a great sound. This whole thing about specific mic pre's and specific boards, yes, they all have their own characteristics. But if you're any good at what you do, you can get a good sound out of anything. The number of times I've been asked, what's the most important thing in a home studio or in any studio? And I always say it's the monitors, the speakers that you listen through, because you can have the biggest, all of the gear that you use can be the shittiest there is. But if you know what you're listening to, you can get a great thing out of it. Just think of Joe Meek, like the stuff that he put together, and he cobbled things together, and it got some amazing things. But if the monitors that you're using aren't up to par, then you can have the best gear in the world or down in front of you, and you won't know what you're hearing. So probably even with the best gear, you won't get a great sound.
I mean, monitors are expensive. They feels like they only benefit the person who's listening to them, whereas I guess a lot of people will want to invest money in what they think other people will hear is good. But what you're saying is right, that if you're hearing it right, then it sounds good, and then the other people will hear it right and it will sound good. That's
precisely.
Yeah.
Look, also if reading the book, the story of Hey Jude,
Yes.
where we started to work on Hey Jude at Abbey Road because of a film crew coming in. It all sort of went the wrong way, and they were booked. The band were booked into Trident Studios, which was a brand new facility at that point. It was the first studio in England with 8-track. And they wanted to experiment with 8-track. So they had 3 days booked at the studio. They went there and they recorded Hey Jude and mixed it there. Well, I went down the last night and heard the mix. And I sat in front of the mixing console, and they played it for me. And I was absolutely blown away. It sounded amazing. I'd never heard anything sound so good, so loud and clean. It was incredible. Couple of days later, the tape finishes up at Abbey Road, and they're cutting playback acetates of it up in one of the mastering rooms. And I go up to listen to it, and there was absolutely no high end on it whatsoever. It sounded as if there was a pillow in front of the speaker. And it finished up. We spent ages EQing it to try and get some high end onto it. And that's what finished up being released. But what I eventually found out, because I then eventually went to work at Trident, the monitors in there were putting out much too much high end. So you think you've got enough when you're in the control room, and it sounds great. But because it's boosted too much coming out, there actually isn't enough on the tape.
Yeah, so obviously the argument for hearing, making sure you're hearing correctly.
Yeah, because they had top-notch gear, really good gear, but the monitors were hyped so that it would sound better there than it did anywhere else.
Something I wanted to ask you, now we're kind of there in the era that now. I seen some of the pictures in the book of what Abbey Road was like at the time. It looks very clinical compared to what studios look like nowadays. Very clean and no comfy chairs around, and we imagine studios as being quite a comfortable creative place now.
It wasn't in the slightest. It was very cold. You were there to work. And it's at one point that the Beatles were asked, how can we make the studio better for you? One of the things that they said was, can we have some colored lights? Now, this was in the height of psychedelia and all of that. And still, all the studio had were bright white lights all the way along the studio. There was no dimmer. There was nothing. They were either on or off. So that was the room that all of that creativity from the Beatles through Pink Floyd, all of these, that's how it was. We had to create within a very, very cold situation. And because you're dealing with professionals, they did it.
I'm interested in the dynamic of the control room. There's not always an engineer and a producer and the band like there perhaps used to be, and even a second engineer and all this kind of thing that used to be that way. From your experiences, do you think that there's merit in people retaining job roles like that, in that aids creativity, the fact that you could concentrate on engineering, which meant that George Martin could concentrate on producing and not have to worry about the technical sides of things?
To me, you need to have at least one outside person, be that, call him the producer, call him the engineer, whatever. You need that outside ear that will guide the artist along as they're struggling to give the right performance. That one person can say, if they thought they did a bad performance but it was really good, you need that outside ear to say, are you kidding? That was great. That was amazing. Or if they think it's great, you know what? You can do better. You've got to have that. For me personally, you've got to have that outside ear. I can't think of many people, maybe Prince. There aren't many people that can produce themselves.
Yeah, having thought about it, there isn't. I can't think of any off the top of my head. I'm just satisfying my own curiosity here. Were you aware at the time when you were working with the Beatles? I mean, now they're beyond belief the size that band is. I mean, presumably that felt special at the time, but not. It perhaps didn't feel as you might not have been aware of just how stratospheric they were going to become, or was it that way at the time?
No, look, we knew they were huge at the time, absolutely. But to be talking about them 50 years later, absolutely no way on earth. As I often say, rock and roll wasn't even that old at that point. So the fact that people would still be talking about it in 50 years is absolute insanity to me. We should be talking about modern music, but unfortunately, it doesn't live up to what was being produced back then.
I just think that's really interesting, and I love the idea that you wrote a letter to what was EMI, and then what was it, 4 years later, you're engineering the biggest band on the planet. That doesn't feel like a story that is possible to exist in this day and age.
I agree. Look, there have been so many things. The first session I'm ever assistant engineer on was the Beatles, side 2 of Hard Day's Night. The first thing I ever engineer is the Beatles. The first thing I ever produce is Hunky Dory, David Bowie. A lot of engineers cut their teeth doing ads, radio ads, TV ads, the music for that and all of that. I only ever did one ad, and that was the Coke ad, I'd like to buy the world a Coke, which became the ad of the 70s. It boosted Coke sales by 25%. It was astounding. It just, the way things came together for me, just phenomenal. And then being able to extend my career into a whole different area, starting with Mahavishnu Orchestra, moving into the jazz fusion area. When I was doing the book, I spoke to each member of Mahavishnu and asked them, why me? Because here was this English engineer that worked with the likes of the Beatles and David Bowie and Elton John. Why would a band like Mahavishnu Orchestra suddenly want to work with me? It made no sense, but it worked. Amazingly, it worked. And that set me on a whole different career, working with Mahavishnu, with Stanley Clarke, with Billy Cobham, Dixie Dregs. It just amazing.
What do you think it is about you that drew artists to you in that way?
I don't know. I have no idea. They obviously like what I do. So that's all I can say. And what I do is very little. I rely on the artist. When I set up a session, I set up the session exactly the same way every single time. I always use the same mics. It's always the same. The EQ I use is always the same. I rely on the changes in sound and in everything coming from the studio, from the musician, from his instrument. That's where it comes together. And once again, that goes back to working at Abbey Road on 4-track, because the desks that we had back then, the red desks, the EQ was so limited. You learned back then that you get the sound in the studio because you can't do much in the control room.
You had top and bottom, that's it, wasn't it? High end and low end.
It was mids. It was 5K and 100 cycles. And there was a box that we used to call a presence box that you could plug in, which was you could add or cut at either 2.7, 3.5 or 10K.
Wow.
So that was how limited we were. How little that EQ affected anything. There are several tracks on the White Album. The Beatles got this thing in their brain that they wanted every track to have full bass and full treble. So before we ever set up the mix, pulled up a fader, they'd say, okay, full bass and full treble on everything. And that's what we did.
I love that.
And you can't really tell the difference which ones were like that and which ones we did very carefully. So it shows how little effect our EQ had. It all had to come from the studio. And that stuck with me all the way through the years. It's still that way.
I think that's I think that's what I took away from your book, and what I'm really enjoying getting from speaking to you now is just how inspiring that message is of using the same things every time. And it demystifies the recording process for a lot of people, I think, and makes it about the music and the song. And
that's what it should be about. If you've got a good song, you've got a good performer, it's easy. For me, It's been such a joy doing what I do, because so much of it is I get the sound, then I can just put my feet up on the board and just have great music wafting over me. And then it's down to the musicians.
Along these lines, if you were to give a piece of advice to artists who are home recording, or even aspiring engineers, if there was one lasting piece of advice you could give, what do you think it would be?
I have no idea. I have a piece of advice that I tend to give students for when they leave school and are looking for a gig. I just tell them, write a letter. It's no one writes letters anymore. It's all done by email. And I don't know if you're like me, but I get so many emails, most of them go straight into the trash. And it's if you send a letter, that puts you apart from almost everyone else, which immediately will stand out to a studio manager.
Hearing that advice, to me, that also means don't be afraid to ask the question. Again, from the stories that you say in your book, you don't seem to have been afraid to take on responsibility and do the things that people ask you to do. You know, there must have been a huge weight on your shoulders, or you must have felt it when you went to engineer your first Beatles session as an engineer.
Are you kidding? It was horrendous. It was what I'd wanted for years, but it was so scary.
But you did it, and you were willing to put yourself in that position and take the bull by the horn, so to speak.
You've got to. I even up to today, in a totally different way. My wife and I, as I said, we were living in Nashville, and we had to get out of the States. We had to leave that country, and talking to a friend, I was then offered this gig at Leeds Beckett University, and within, I think it was about 6 or 7 weeks, we sold up everything we had in the States, lost a fortune doing it because we had to do it so quickly, but sold up everything, moved over here, not having a place to live, not knowing the area at all or anything like that. We moved over with 6 suitcases.
Wow.
That's at like 68, I think I was at the time. If you don't go for things, then what's life all about? It's very unexciting. It's very boring.
I've got one last question that's just, again, to satisfy my own curiosity. Billy Cobham, what was he like to work with?
Amazing. I'll say the same for most musicians that I've worked with. They're great. Bill was one of the heaviest drummers, hardest hitters that I've worked with. And that comes from kneeling down, placing a bass drum mic when he suddenly decides to crash a cymbal and right by my ear. Oh, my hearing was bad for a little while after that. But no, he really nice guy. Yeah, great talent. Great writer as well. Some of the stuff that he wrote.
Spectrum, I don't know how I came across it, but as a young teenager, just really gripped me. There was something about that album that's very special.
It's a very special album. That to me was the most definitive jazz fusion album, and I say that because the mix between rock and jazz on that is amazing, and that's because you've got Bill and you've got Jan Hammer, who come from jazz backgrounds. You've got the bass player Lee Sklar. He's a session bass player. He's played with everyone, and then you've got Tommy Bolin, who he was nothing but a rock and roll guitarist. That's what he wanted. He wanted to be the ultimate rock and roll star. And somehow all of those 4 people fitted together so well on that album. And it was a classic. And once again, it was, for me, it was put the mics in place, listen, twiddle a few knobs, sit back with my feet up on the board and just listen to great music.
I think that just about sums up everything that you've been saying. I'm really conscious of taking up too much of your time, and I could listen to you talk all day. It's so honestly so inspiring to speak to you. Just to hear the way that you do things and your philosophy on all these things. It's been really special. Thank you.
Oh, some people think I'm a grumpy old man these days, including me. But
I think we've all got a grumpy old man in us somewhere.
now, I'll say, if you want to do this again later on down the line or something, then I'm more than willing. That
would be amazing. I'm sure that I'll come up with 100 questions that I didn't ask, but I would, I'd really appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Ken, and I will no doubt speak to you again in the future. I do appreciate it.
All right. Go. Good luck.
There we are, and I hope you enjoyed listening to that conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. I am hoping to get Ken back on to answer some of your questions and do a special question and answer episode of the podcast, so do look out for that. Next week, we're going to be chatting to Stuart Taverner from X Audio, who is a microphone and vintage microphone specialist and builder. He is a goldmine of information about all things microphones, so look out for that coming in 2 weeks' time. I'd like to thank my good friend Joe Kane for the theme music for this podcast, and another good friend of mine, David Henshaw, for all the design. You can check out show notes for this episode at allyouneedisdrums.com/that60s recording podcast. That's 60S for 60s. I'll put links to everything that I discussed with Ken, and you can check me out at allyouneedisdrums on Instagram and /allyouneedisdrums on Facebook. And thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, please put a review, like, comment and share, and all the things you do with podcasts, and I look forward to doing this again next week. Goodbye.